is no clear path to what success means. And it was not until I made my debut on 2020 last year that my father finally said to me that he was proud of me. And that was everything, especially given the fact that when the pandemic broke out and I started really reporting on crimes and racism toward Asian Americans and other minority groups, my mother sent me an email saying, "Stop doing this. You're making our people look bad." So that further solidified the need and my own purpose to keep going because I knew it would pay off. And when my father said that he was proud of me, it meant the world. It meant that I had that validation. Even though you're not supposed to need that validation, it was still like completing the puzzle in my purview.
I attended the executive leadership program for AHA, where I went to New York for 3 days, 4 days, and sat in a corporate boardroom from like 8:30 in the morning till like 5:30 at night. We had facilitators, we had training. It was about power, authority, and also we had a huge section of how our Asian American or Asian culture can either be a plus or could hold us back. And what were those things that hold us back? And what were the plus things that made us good leaders too? Great discussion, self-reflection, a lot of discovery about who we are, how do we define ourselves, our identity, all that kind of question. It got really emotional because a lot of the personal things that you have bottled up for so many years just kind of came out.
In the last few years, where race really became at the center of a lot of our conversations, with Asian hate, and then George Floyd, you saw a lot of the stations wanting to promote minorities, and you wondered, is that because they really care about promoting minorities and giving us these opportunities, or is it because they just want to look like they're doing the right thing right now?
I am appreciative of the fact that I now live in a community that really does not express that kind of hate. The view of Asian Americans in Hawaii is very much different than the mainland. So having said that, how we react to that issue is, again, still with appall, but not as activism as it would be on the mainland. I'm really disturbed because I have relatives across the country, and I have older individuals who also have lived through their own life of prejudice, and now to be attacked for their color, their skin, I find to be reprehensible in America.
Not only were you feeling like you were a target, that you were a journalist, but now you're doubly target because now you're an Asian American journalist. And so, people would shout in the street at me. Like, I remember one time, literally seconds before a live shot, someone yelled at me, like, "Go back to China." And this was like 6 a.m. that someone would yell this at me driving by, like in the dark before sunrise. How much hate do you have in your body to feel the need to stop your car, roll down the window, and shout that at somebody?
I thought about all those times that I stayed quiet. I thought about all those times that I did not fight in editorial meetings or did not say something when something felt a little bit off. And I thought, people are dying. Grandmas are getting beat up and left on playgrounds. If I don't do something, who's going to speak out and do something about it? So that ignited this fire in the pit of my stomach that really motivated me to keep pushing despite all of these really terrible, horrific stories, and to keep going even though there has been a tremendous amount of pushback.
I know a lot of people feel like their voice may not matter in the newsroom, but you got to keep pushing because that's the only way it'll matter. You can't give up. And you gotta keep saying, "Hey guys, I know I've talked about this, but this is important. We shouldn't wait until an incident happens to cover. In fact, we should be talking about the underlying issues, the roots of the problem and the cause of the issue of these issues, rather than reacting, after the fact."
When you're doing these stories on diversity and you're providing diverse coverage, you're showing different faces and hearing different viewpoints, and just men on the street interviews that are more diverse than are just your typical folks that you see all the time. I think that is investing and it's adding money in the bank, and it is going to be remembered by folks in those communities, and in the end, it builds public trust.
Hello again, and welcome to our monthly Candid Discussion series, Diversity. Let's really talk about it. I'm Bob Rucker, chair of the Diversity Committee and a member of the Board of Governors for the San Francisco and Northern California chapter of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. You know, anyone who loves history or just paid attention in school can probably recall the great contributions to humanity from one region of the world made up of many diverse, accomplished, and proud cultures whose values, wisdom, practices, and traditions have been handed down for centuries and earned profound respect and admiration from people all over the world. Well, each year in May, our country celebrates and takes time to listen and learn about Asian Americans and Pacific Islander cultures and life experiences. Today, our television chapter is thrilled to do the same thing with some outstanding professional representatives working in journalism who are willing to open up and share their unique career experiences and insights to help all Academy members and television management to understand why their skills, efforts, and voices uniquely connect and resonate with TV viewers in their communities. Now, as you heard in the open, our distinguished guests will also talk about the threats, the concerns, and challenges they report on, and sometimes face themselves on the streets, in their newsrooms, and TV station meetings across the country. You know, at a time when journalists can so easily be ridiculed and dismissed, this new Academy Diversity Series enables more and more people in our industry to understand how our unrelenting passion for storytelling about cultures can take us to a new level of community engagement, awareness, and appreciation, not to mention open new avenues for continuing trust. Now, each month, we start these candid interactions by inviting each participant to give their name, job title, and location, and then share a little bit about their individual cultural identities. Previously in the series, I've already told people I'm African American and from Chicago. But nearly 4 decades of 4 family meetings, discussions, community value input, all of that helped to shape my career decision-making. My dad even said to me once, you know, a Black kid on the South Side will never be able to make it in TV news in the 1970s. But I always worried more about not disappointing or poorly representing my people on television. Eventually, it would take hundreds of my college media students from a wide range of cultural backgrounds to confirm for me that everybody shares those things, those thoughts. One of those incredible young professional would-bes back then is on our panel today. So Kit Do, if you don't mind, please join us now and start the conversation about self-identification.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kiet Do. I'm a reporter at KPIX 5 in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm Vietnamese American, and I am one of 6 Vietnamese male on-air reporters or anchors in the entire country. And my claim to fame is I was born on April 30th, 1975, and that is the exact day that the Vietnam War ended. And within Vietnamese culture, my actual birthday is referred to as the day we lost our country. So as you can imagine, when I cover stories about the Vietnamese community, there is a heavy weight that I feel on my shoulders and a big responsibility. So that's me.
Thank you, Kit. Janice?
Jen. I am actually from California, born and raised in Stockton. But I currently live in Hawaii. I'm the news director at the ABC station in Hawaii. I have been in this business for a very long time. I've been in this business for about 3 decades, maybe, and I've worked across the country in various newsrooms, got involved because I'm in management because I decided one day that if I was going to have an impact for people of color, hiring people, making sure the stories get told, maybe getting stories told the right way is why I'm in the business.
Very good, Janice. Thank you, and good to have you back on one of our sessions. George, a first-timer joining us today. How are you, George?
Thank you for having me. I'm George Kiriyama, the managing editor at KTVU here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a third-generation Japanese American from Southern California. My family and a lot of my family's friends basically shaped by the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. I heard the stories growing up from my grandparents and my parents, and that motivated me to do more for my community, not just from a civic and political point of view, but from a journalistic point of view, to tell stories. And it drives me every day, from when I was a reporter to now as a manager, to tell those stories of our diverse communities and make sure that their voices are heard. Proud to be part of this discussion and this conversation today.
Well, we're happy to have you. And once a TV reporter, now in management. Oh, yes, we need to talk to you. But let's go on to Dion Lim right now. Dion, hello.
Hi, so happy to be here. So my name is Dion Lim. I'm a news anchor and reporter at ABC7 KGO-TV in San Francisco, and I am the daughter of immigrants from Taiwan and Hong Kong who grew up in very non-diverse places in the country, parts of Michigan, Ohio, and Connecticut. And when I started working in this television news industry, I was the first Asian American person to be not marginalized on the undesirable shifts, but an anchor Monday through Friday, the first Asian woman to be at the helm of those newscasts in my stations in Kansas City, in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Tampa Bay, Florida. I didn't understand quite the gravity or the importance of me being there. I thought I filled a quota, but it really wasn't until I came to the Bay Area I realized the power of my voice in those editorial meetings, in those newsrooms, and that it is not just a matter of representation, it's what you do with the seat that you happen to be in. So happy to be here.
Very well said. Thank you. Good to have you here. Pamela Young, welcome back. We enjoyed having you in a previous session. Thank you for wanting to join us again.
Thank you. Aloha. I'm Pamela Young, KHON Special Projects Producer in my 47th year in broadcast. Yikes. Starting first in San Francisco and then moving back home to Hawaii as a reporter, anchor, producer, and now, because of the times, also a videographer and editor. I'm the NATAS Hawaii VP and a national trustee, and I identify as a Hawaii-born Chinese American.
Thank you for coming back, and we'll be coming back to you shortly. And Brian, welcome to our panel. I'm very happy to see a photographer represented.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I feel honored. My name is Brian Yuen. I'm a photojournalist, KPIX 5 CBS in San Francisco, Asian American, born and raised in Oakland. The mixing pot of California. My kind of structured goal is to always have a diverse face and view and voice. And I see that as a goal of mine to make sure that that's out there.
And your colleagues rave about your photography. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas with us today. And thank you all. And I want to acknowledge Steve Schliske, our director and producer today for this Academy StreamYard production. Steve edited that beautiful open, and he is the past president of our Academy chapter and oversees activities and programs for the Board of Governors. He's also been a driving force and a wonderful collaborator on this project. So thank you, Steve, for being here today. All right, everybody, let's stop being formal. Let's talk. Panel members, we open the door and let's walk down that path. What did your family or cultural communities think about you choosing to go into television news as a career? And you all told me that you have great enthusiasm and passion for telling stories in television journalism. Well, let's talk about that. And Dion, you opened that door, so I'm going to let you start. You told me about your parents. How has that overall worked for you?
I think on the inside they were screaming, hell no, because they could not, because you really can't quantify success in this business, right? It's not like being a doctor, a scientist, a lawyer, right? Where you have a very clear career path. When I told my parents I wanted to do this, it was partially because I had taken a journalism class in high school. full disclosure, there was a boy I liked, so I thought this was a way I could get to know him. Terrible reason, but I realized it was the most exciting possible career that I could have. And I was a very mediocre student, believe it or not. So I did not fit that model minority myth of being really good at math and being good in school. So I discovered that talking to people was much more interesting. Long story short, my parents, they were horrified that when I took my first reporting job in Springfield, Massachusetts, they said, we sent you to college to learn journalism and you're making $12 an hour, maybe $12.50. And to them, every time I got a new job, the first question was, how much money are you going to make? Because to them, the dollar figure was how to quantify how successful their daughter was. So I don't think they fully grasped it until I appeared on network TV and they could watch me from their rural Connecticut home, that they realized, oh, okay, their child is somewhat good at what they do.
Great feeling, isn't it, when they can finally see that you really can do this? I remember my first job, my first year salary was $9,700.
How is that possible?
Welcome to the 1970s. Oh, it was a lot of fun. Let's go to someone else. Who else wants to jump in here?
See me? Can you hear me? Okay.
Sure.
I will say this. My mom and dad were public school teachers in the LA Unified School District. So my dad was a government U.S. history teacher. My mom was an English teacher. So that background alone is kind of, for me, the foundation of journalism. And so when I told them I wanted to be a broadcast journalist, they were supportive of that. But my mom in particular was very worried about, as Dion was talking about, the money. She was also worried about upward mobility. She did not see, and at that time I wanted to be a reporter and being on air. She did not see the number of Asian American men on air to justify me going into this business. She was worried about a glass ceiling, that I wouldn't be able to make it to my goal, which was to get to either San Francisco Bay Area or Los Angeles. So she was really worried about that, but they were supportive of journalism. They always read the Los Angeles Times, watched network news, watched local news, discussed current events. So in that regard, I was lucky. I didn't have that pushback of, we want you to be a doctor or a lawyer or a dentist, something more traditional. So I was very happy about that.
Well, very good. And we're glad that you did. So thank you for making that choice. Pamela, let's bring you back and talk about some more of the things that you mentioned earlier. Being a person in our industry, but also from the Asian American community, what did you find from your family and your culture about your choice?
Well, first of all, my parents were shocked because there were no role models in Hawaii or even on national television at that time. So they were very surprised. This is not where I got my degrees in. So it was just a choice that came out of the blue as far as they were concerned. They were proud, but they were also concerned. And that's because of the way they grew up. People in their generation in Hawaii, their parents were plantation immigrants, where you learned if you want to survive, you obey and you know your place. And when you presume that you are as good as at that time, white people, the ruling class, then sooner or later you're going to get slammed and you're going to put your family into disgrace. Disgrace is a big word in Asian American culture. And so so they were very concerned. I mean, when I was in high school, one of my teachers suggested that I compete in a school speech festival. And I was up against these students from private schools, where the student body was mostly Caucasian. And my mother said, "Why are you doing this? You don't stand a chance." And I kept thinking, there are parents, Asian American parents all over this country saying the same things to their kids. And many of those kids are going to say, okay, I'm going to withdraw. I'm going to be in my little box and I'm going to know my place. And for me, it just kind of made me a little angry and wanted me to compete even more, which I did, and I won. And they still were very concerned that I didn't know my place. So being on television just kind of continued that concern, especially since I started in San Francisco. They didn't know the market. They didn't know the culture in San Francisco. So there was always that concern that sooner or later that hammer was going to come down and that it was going to be a negative experience.
I think my parents probably worried about the same thing, and that disgrace possibility hanging over your head. That puts a lot of pressure on you at the outset of a career. Thank you. And let's stay in Hawaii and go to Janice Jen. Janice, I've often wondered, how did you tell your parents, this is what I'm going to do?
I should say a couple things is that I grew up at a time where basically my parents were happy that I had a job. So whether or not it was television or whatever, you had a paycheck. There wasn't a lot of concern about how much you were making. But I'll tell you a story that when I have an older sister who ironically at the same time, she and I both went into journalism. We both went into television. So that sort of, they didn't have any question about what I was doing. The question that I had is because my sister is talent and in our home market, she would be on TV. And my mother would say, how come I don't see you on TV? And how come you have to work holidays? How come you're not anchoring? I go, because I'm the boss, because I'm the producer of the show. I tell her what to do. So the idea of, growing up in Stockton, I grew up in a very, if you will, in the ghetto, as me and my sister would say, you can take us out of the ghetto, but you can't take the ghetto out of the girl. So the idea of having to be activist and making sure you represent your community is important. So I grew up at a time where I like to say it's post all the civil rights stuff, where Asian Americans compared to other minority groups weren't yet being heard very loudly because both my sister and I worked at different television stations, had some power or control or authority to push for coverage of the Asian American community in our market, really helped the community to have a voice. And that voice brought pride to my family. Again, a lot of it went to my sister because she was the on-air talent. Some of you know her. She's won many Emmy Awards, done a lot of Asian American work. And my parents were never disappointed to that extent.
Mm-hmm. Is what they could see.
Yeah, my father always said that you had to speak up for your people. My father, too, in his own way, was sort of his own activist, right? So that how we followed in that sort of lineage made sense.
Absolutely, I understand. Thanks for sharing that. That's very interesting. And Brian, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about, you have this career as a photographer, but how did you tell your parents, and why do you have this passion for storytelling?
Yeah, I think my parents were really kind of unsure about me going into broadcast journalism and television and being a camera person. But they were supportive, and they said, you know what, we're gonna let him do this. And then I think time is gonna kind of wear him out. And he's, my first job was $4 an hour in Flagstaff, Arizona. I was living in a house with 5 guys, so they probably thought, you know what, that's gonna get old real fast. But I was really committed to making sure this was gonna happen, and I really believed in everything that I was doing. And I'll put that back on my parents because when I was younger, and they always were very patriotic about the United States. They bought American cars for the longest time, and they ingrained that in me, that America's number one. It's the best country in the world. That's why they came here and started a family here and brought the family here. So I put it on them that it was ingrained in me that I became patriotic, believed in the Constitution, and believe in the First Amendment. And now I constantly work daily to defend it.
And you're a graduate of San Francisco State, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, go Gators. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we Spartans are very proud of you anyway. Okay. Congratulations. That was wonderful. Before we transition to one of the major timely topics, which is about hate crimes and issues, before we start that, I just wanted to have everybody offer some thoughts about COVID and the impact it's had in terms of your reporting, in terms of your workload, in terms of your family life. And then we'll talk about hate crimes. Anyone can start.
I would tell you that because Hawaii is such a unique location with regards to Asian Americans, with regards to people who look Asian. The way we look at it in Hawaii, and I thought this was, to me, extraordinarily interesting. We actually break it down by race. So Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Polynesian. So when you look at the statistics that were provided by the Department of Health, you look at the disparity among those individual racial groups as opposed to as a whole. So what do we find? We should not be surprised. The Japanese and the Chinese got vaccination immediately. The white people got immediately. The Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians getting vaccine was very low. And so there was a big campaign, or it has always been a big campaign here in Hawaii, to get that population vaccinated. Now, I don't want to take a position on to vaccinate or not to vaccinate, just to say that, Brian talks about the patriotic feeling. I grew up in that too. My dad always bought American cars. He was chagrined when I bought a Kiet, absolutely, and refused to drive my car for a while, which was a good thing. But when the historical background on Native Hawaiians is sort of anti-U.S. government, there's this distress about not wanting to believe what the government is telling you to do. So that campaign and the responsibility of media to get the word out. I always believe that we should not proselytize, you need to get a vaccine. Our responsibility is to say, well, let's talk about why it might be really smart for you. If it's not for you, it's not for you. But we really reached out to lots of communities, making sure they got to explain why they did not want to deal with COVID-19. Maybe they were wrong, but we let them speak about it. And I think it's important that we give them a voice and perhaps express it as I don't trust the government. This theme is not inconsistent with what was going on in the country. But ethnically, I would say stereotypically, the Japanese, and maybe perhaps as Pamela talked about, you don't make waves. You just follow kind of what you're told. They had great compliance. So Japanese was way up there. Chinese people way up there doing what the government said to do. And that I found very interesting and a story to tell. So for our community is telling what groups view this COVID situation differently. And the corresponding death rate and all that kind of stuff corresponds to this acceptance of vaccine. At least that's what we see statistically.
Very, very good. And George, that makes me want to bring you in now to talk about your perspective as a manager and overseeing the coverage of COVID and the vaccines and all of that. What did you find in Oakland and in the Bay Area?
But when COVID hit in 2020 and all of 2021, I was the managing editor at the ABC affiliate in Las Vegas. I could tell you that, when the vaccination stories, we started doing stories about the vaccines and whether you should get a vaccine or not get a vaccine. I was keeping tabs along with one of the reporters about our diverse communities and seeing what they were thinking and what they were having conversations with their communities. Those spurred stories, and it was good that we did that because, as Janice was saying, we're not supposed to say get a vaccine or don't get a vaccine. We're allowing the viewers to determine that, and that was kind of the discussion that we had in the newsroom. Is that however you feel about the vaccines, you've got to make sure that in our reporting that we're just sticking to what is being said by the CDC, what our local doctors are saying, what our communities are talking about, and then doing those stories as such. So, but for me, looking at how the Asian American community, the API community was responding, it was interesting because there was a huge push to get vaccines from the various Asian American leaders, even whether they were Republican or Democrat. We did see a push to get their communities vaccinated. It took a long, long time. Nevada is a purple state, not quite blue, not quite red. So there was that kind of tug of war going on politically. But from a medical point of view, it seemed like the Asian American community was responding in kind, and we saw the rates pretty good. As Janice was talking about, we did see a significant amount of Asian Americans getting their vaccines.
Very good. And let's move on to the next topic of discussion, which is probably the most prevalent and certainly weighing on a lot of you right now, as you continue to cover hate crimes and incidents in your community. I was doing some research before this event, and I wanted to let you know that ABC was reporting as late as last October that hate crimes against people of Asian descent rose by 76% in the year 2020, and that's according to data by the FBI. They define hate crimes as violence against a person or property with a biased motivation. And the FBI says about victims, everybody has their own way of reacting. Sometimes victims go immediately into crisis and crisis intervention. Sometimes the full impact isn't felt for hours, days, even weeks or months after the criminal event. Now, we do have a graphic, so I'm going to ask Steve if he would bring that up, because this graphic is provided by a coalition that tracks hate incidents and hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. It shows nearly 11,000 hate incidents from March 2020 to December 2021, and nearly 62% of those were reported by women. Now, their survey also found that Asian American men are as likely to experience hate crimes and incidents as Asian women, but Asian American men are less likely to report that. And their report goes on to say that 83% of Asian American parents are telling their group they are concerned going forward that their children may be bullied because of their race and their ethnicity. Again, this is just a snapshot of one group's look and study of the issue so far. But some of you have made a major point of zeroing in on this issue and looking at the language of some of the things that we have to be careful saying, that journalism taught us not to take sides or to be neutral, as opposed to talk to these people about saving lives. And I can think of a few people here who might want to start on this, but I'm going to call on Kit Doe first.
Like, who thought in this day and age that we would be talking about racism, against Asian people? And I remember a time where Asian American Journalists Association, they were kind of like scratching their heads and saying, well, we're not hearing as much about racism anymore. So they were kind of looking for the next sort of big topic of discussion and what kind of motivates the organization. And so for a time, it seemed like it was ebbing and flowing, and it was kind of at a low point. But here we are, 2022, and it is front and center. And so the question then becomes, like, how do you, as a journalist, when these things are happening, right? Like the most current, like what I'm feeling now is, how do you battle this sense of fatigue? Like, how do you keep these stories in the public? How do you convince your management that you want to continue to do these stories when they all start blurring together? I'm glad that Dion is here, because I really want to hear how she's approaching this, because to me it's absolutely fascinating that the place that she's in, the position that she occupies right now, like in the national conversation, is utterly fascinating to me. And I want to hear more from her about how it came to be in this way. Do you feel a burden on you? How can we help share and carry this burden with you? Because I feel like you're doing a lot of the heavy lifting now, and I think like more of us could do more.
Yeah, I appreciate that so incredibly much, because most oftentimes I say that the best thing people can do to show allyship is just to say, hey, what can I do? Or how are you doing? Just to give everybody an idea, I just pulled up my own social media. And as you can see, there are people who are bandaged and bloodied almost every single day. And oftentimes I am told, why can't your social media be a little bit happier? And I have to apologize, but I'm not really apologizing, because I'm unapologetic about what I do, and say, well, this is what's happening. And if I don't show people what's happening, they're not going to understand. For me, I was always taught, right, as a journalist, we are supposed to tell the news, that you don't interject any of you into it unless it's a story about going to the state fair and here are some funnel cakes and you can eat them on morning TV. But I think in this day and age, with the level of competition that there is, with the way social media works, at the speed of light that people are sharing videos and stories and incidents, um, to me, I just dropped that entire barrier because there was one particular story that kicked everything off. Kit, you may remember, it was in the Bayview district of San Francisco where there was that can collector who was beaten and humiliated. People were barking at him. He's an elderly man who I was telling Bob looked eerily like my dad, his nose, his jacket, everything. And I froze. Like I felt so powerless until I realized that until I share why I'm so upset, people aren't going to get the full magnitude of it. So to me, it's a basic human reaction, and that I need people to see it because Asian Americans are so, I wouldn't say closed off, but reticent to talk because of the cultural, ideas of staying honorable and keeping that sense of honor within the family, that bringing highlights to negativity. Me doing my job to my mom was being too out there and brought disrespect. So, in order to get these people, these victims, to share these really intimate moments, these lowest lows of their lives, I have to let some of myself go because that way people trust and then understand that their story is safe with me, that I will do you right, and that I'm not just doing this for deadline to make lots of clicks and likes on my social media or the station website, but that, I really do care because this resonates differently than a wildfire or a mass shooting. This becomes personal.
Have you ever been accused of being an activist?
Yeah, all the time. All the time. I make the difference that it's not activism, but activating. That's the terminology that I have adapted. Because look, I'm not going to go to a rally and beat my chest and have a megaphone with a sign, but I am going to provide you stories and dig for stories that may enact change. And to me, I think that is a little bit of a gray line, but if we don't do it, I don't know what else we can do. I also wouldn't feel comfortable going to a rally or to speak out against something. I mean, a politician, for example, who has been seen as anti-Asian, I would never, because that would be a dig to my own credibility. And the whole goal when people are saying this is fake news or this is being inflated to get headlines, we need to prove more than ever that we are trying to do our best to show the whole scope and the whole context of what's happening.
Are your the station and then more broadly the corporate owners, how do they view this? Do they encourage you? Do they because the way I see it, this is like kind of like the cutting edge of where journalism is heading. I mean, if we're not supposed to take a stand, but if you were allowed to take a stand, I mean, how could you argue against taking a stand against racism? If a corporate owner were to say, if anything were okay, that would be the thing, because we have news personalities who are standing on top of floats at the Pride Parade. We make all these like appearances in support of these diversity efforts. So, if you're going to be pro-diversity, it's also okay to be anti-racism. Yeah.
I'm really glad you asked this question. It's complicated, right? And I want to be appropriate about it. Uh-oh, Bob.
Well, I was just going to say, I really appreciate what you two are showcasing because I want the rest of the group to try to do the same thing. And you two hold on because I'm going to come back to some videos that you both produced that I think we want to talk about. But let me bring into the conversation at this point, Brian, because Brian, you and I had a conversation on the phone the other day about your earliest days in television. It triggered a change in the community where you were working, where they had to deal with racism.
Yeah, I was in Ohio at the time, and I just finished work. I was working the night shift, and I was relaxing at a park, and a police officer came up and said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And we exchanged some words, pleasantries, unpleasantries, and in the end, he said, they don't like my kind here. And, I had grown up watching movies, watching programs about this, but being born and raised in the Bay Area, I had never really come face to face with this growing up, because living in the Bay Area, you heard about it, but I never felt it. But suddenly being confronted with it from somebody that I'm supposed to respect, a police officer, really threw me back. And it kind of hit to the core. And there were two other young officers there. And this other gentleman was a little bit older. He walked back to the police car, and the two other officers stepped up and they apologized for him. And in that instance, I knew something had gone awry with this older police officer and the educational, training of police officers there. So I, sort of said, hey, where is your city hall and where's the address? Because I want to talk to the mayor about this tomorrow. And ironically, the next day, fast forward, I'm sitting in City Hall, and the police chief walks up to me, and he intercepts me, sits down, and we have a conversation. And he says, "What?" And we went over the evening, what had happened, and he said, "Well, the officers, he's been on the force forever. We put him on the night shift. That way he can do the least amount of damage." And I said, that is the wrong reason. I mean, having an officer out there that looks at a skin tone and a color and will have the audacity to really put it out there and say it too, and treat you less than citizen. And so we talked a little more, and he said, "What can I do?" Which really kind of struck me, because I think he also knew I worked in the media, and we hadn't gone to that level yet. And he said, "What can we do to prevent this from blowing up and you going to talk to the mayor?" And so at that point, I felt the power was put, a decision was made for me to say, hey, you know what? You need to start a program of diversity and train your officers so this does not happen again. Because, at that point, I had not seen anything where we are today, where you have the AAPI hate. But I sort of felt that it was my responsibility to say, hey, you know what? I don't want somebody else to have to go through this. And imagine if that person wasn't a journalist or didn't have a platform to say, hey, this is wrong. And the established government, police, weren't kept in check. So I felt in that sense, I was able to hopefully make a change.
You met the moment. You spoke up and you made a change that triggered some other changes.
Yes, absolutely. But, it's kind of interesting, because I don't know about everybody else, but when you go through those moments, if I just start talking about it, I can take myself back to the moment, and you can relive a lot of the trauma. And so over years and years and years, you carry this trauma, and, you have to make change. You have to speak up, because you don't want to be silent, because the next person behind you may be trampled on even more. They may lose even more of their liberties. So when you have the opportunity, you need to step up and speak up.
Very good points. And I just want to bring in Pamela and again Janice to talk about the cultural identity and the prejudice concerns over in Hawaii are very different than what's happening in the mainland. Pamela, go ahead.
Well, I applaud him for speaking up, because that's the first step. Here in Hawaii, as Janice said, there are very few overt instances of Asian hate. And the way that we try to make a change is to do more stories about our community that are positive, because all of this hate stems from ignorance and fear. And so whenever I have the opportunity, and I am in an enviable position where I can suggest stories and do them, and I'm out of the general assignment loop, that I can do that. And because of that, I've been approached by some national Asian American societies to do some work for them. And I've done that for free, because all of this is furthering people's understanding of what our communities are all about. And that's, the little that we can do.
I would just want to add, and again, Pamela, I've only been in the market for about 3 years. So I didn't grow up here and I don't have the same sentiment. So sometimes I ask the question, how come? How come we're not activists? I, for 20 years I was in the Bay Area. When we have a protest in the Bay Area, it's Powell Street and Civic Center, and we're there. There's not that kind of activism in Hawaii. I don't want to suggest that Hawaii people don't care. It's just the perspective is different. So many of you, I note, for example, I think this story went national where a guy in Honolulu's Chinatown, drug addict guy, set the jacket or a shirt on fire of an elderly Chinese guy. As far as I can tell, this crime went national. In Honolulu, it is not considered a hate crime. It would be a hate crime in a second in San Francisco. I am like appalled at Hawaii. I'm like, what's the deal here? What I think I really want to point out, though, is that because I live sort of in a homogeneously looking kind of environment, there is divisiveness between the groups. It's not that Hawaii doesn't have prejudice. It has its fair amount of prejudice. It's kind of dissected in a different way. And who it's prejudiced against, if you will, is different than what we understand. I think what's important is to hear the stories of Dion and Ryan and Brian and talk about whether or not we have a responsibility as Asian Americans in general to have to point these issues out. And I think we do. I use this example, and as the media, I have my own philosophy as media. But I think if you don't speak out, you don't get heard. And that's what I tell women and people of color. If you see it's wrong, so Brian, you saw it was wrong, you bring it up. And you don't always get what you want, but if you don't bring it up, nobody else will. Or it's possible that nobody else will. You have to create the consciousness.
I think one of the reasons the incident that you mentioned was not classified as a hate crime is because we have a great deal of homeless crime,
Mm-hmm.
and more so than hate crime. And if you look across the country, many of these acts of Asian hate are made by homeless and mentally deficient people. So there's all sorts of classifications, and some of the incidents that I faced, whenever because I do a great deal of traveling, it's not so much because I'm Asian, but because I'm a woman.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all kinds of prejudice out there, and you just have to take one at a time.
Now let's hold this shot because I want to bring George into this part of the conversation, because you remember in your opening comments, George, you talked about we should be spending more time, and I remember the gesture, looking at the underlying issues, talking about the history, addressing that. It sounds like this is what they're talking about.
It is. And I have to say that all of us bring our unique perspectives and backgrounds to the table, whether from adulthood, whether from our childhood. For me, let me just share with you something very personal. I actually shared it on Facebook last year after the attacks in Atlanta. And it spurred a lot of us to have a voice and really go deep into our personal lives. I have to say that what happened to me when I was around 9 years old really shaped me. It was probably one of those life events where you never forget. And probably to this day is part of the reason why I'm a journalist as well. There's all these seeds that are planted during your life, whether it's from academic or from something very personal. But I think it all adds up to where we are today and where this conversation is right now. So when I'll just tell you the story. When I was 9 years old, I was probably the shortest guy in class. Everyone knew I'm Asian. I was Asian. Got picked on and had a lot of things said to me from a racial perspective. So racism was very alive when I was a kid. And I was picked on and I was bullied, and there were a lot of fights, especially when I would walk home from school. There was these two particular boys who would stand on the sidewalk, and I always went try to go right through them. And every time I did, I got beat up, got kicked to the ground, kicked in the head, hit in the stomach. Happened maybe about 5 times in a row. And then I just got sick and tired of it. So I started taking a longer way home. I got pissed off at that. So I went back right at them again, got beat up again. at that point, I just couldn't take it anymore. I went to my dad. And for the first time, I felt a little ashamed because you don't want to appear weak to your own father. But he took it as a moment to give me confidence. So he put me in judo. And I would say 2 to 3 months later, I mustered up the courage. It's because I was still taking the long way home. I mustered up the courage to go down that sidewalk again, because that was the way I wanted to go home. And these two boys were saying, "Oh, look who's back to get beat up again." I could just hear the words in my head right now, even to this day. So I said, "Guys, look, I don't want any trouble here. I just want to go home." So I walked past them again, and one of them pushed me from behind. I hit the ground, and I got up. My back was still to them. I heard the footsteps coming, and I timed it. So right when he got right to my back, I flipped him over, and he flew, landed on the ground. The second guy got a hold of me. Then I hooked my left foot behind his, went backwards, and I kind of slammed him to the ground. They were on the ground, and I said, "Do not pick on me ever again. I'm going to walk this way home every day. And if you want to do this again tomorrow, I'm game. So I'll see you tomorrow." The next day, they weren't there anymore. I went to my dad and I told him, "Thank you so much for doing what you did. It's giving me confidence. It's also giving me a voice. I felt stronger." And so from that moment, from that day on, it's motivated me. And now as a manager, when I hear stories from our various communities, reporters coming to the table with story ideas, and it's something pertaining to our diverse communities, whether it's of violent nature or not, I'm very, very supportive. In fact, in Vegas, when Jeremy Chen said, "Hey guys, we need to react to this now. We need to do this story now." This was about, Vegas didn't have any violence last year. But we could not say, "Well, we're not going to do the story because our AAPI community is okay." I go, that wasn't the point. And Jeremy fought for it. And I, as the manager, said, "Jeremy, I support you on this. We're going to do the story today. Have it ready for 6. And there was no pushback from other managers or anyone else. And I think that's important to have that support from management. And it's important to have people speak up and know that it's important to speak up, and you're not going to get pushback from managers, at least from my perspective.
That was a very powerful story, and sorry that you had to deal with that at such a young age. But you have a good point here. Speak up and do it in a newsroom setting, do it as a manager, do it when the time is right to do it, when it's happening. Now that brings us back to something that I wanted to show, and I'm going to let our director know we're going to go to a video in just a second. And Dion, I'm going to ask you to react to this video first, and then everyone else can react to it as well. It's sort of a flashback, but it brings to bear this whole concept of how much of it is our responsibility as television journalists to activate or energize people to do something. If we turn back the clock to last year, 2021, Dion Lim did a wonderful story about Lunar New Year. Her package is a visual example of how reporter involvement is addressing the changing times. Let's take a look and listen.
Lunar New Year is a time of fresh beginnings and optimism for the year ahead, which is what the Asian American community needs more now than ever. In the past 12 months, we've battled hate and xenophobia spawned by the pandemic. But recently, a new crisis has emerged, which has challenged my own mental fortitude as a reporter and as a human being. Flooding my social media inboxes and then in our coverage on TV, images and videos of senseless attacks on Asian Americans. This has shaken me and our community to the core. Many victims have been vulnerable seniors, but the wickedness knows no age. On Lunar New Year itself, a young woman was brutally attacked outside her Oakland home. As more of these tragic events unfold, there are signs of change. A new community liaison for the Asian American community in Oakland's Chinatown, who will report directly to the chief. Thousands gathered at vigils and rallies across the Bay Area to come together in a time of crisis. Grassroots efforts to raise money for patrols and keep our streets safe. But there is a long way to go. So as we enter the Year of the Ox, we may not be celebrating with the usual parades and festivities. But what I have now, and perhaps you do as well, is hope that by supporting one another, whether it be something as small as by lending an ear or speaking out, or something as grand such as offering a reward or starting a movement, we can work together and make this Lunar New Year a time of renewal for us all. Now as the Bay Area confronts issues of race
we can
and
pause
social
at that point. Now that is exactly what I want to ask Dion about.
Mm.
You refer to as images of senseless violence, wickedness, challenged your mental fortitude as a reporter, as well as being a human being. You humanized that story beautifully, but you got pushback. Talk to me about that.
Huh. I think pushback for several reasons, right? Because obviously it resonated with a lot of our community in the Bay Area. More than a third of the population is Asian American. So obviously it has resonated, and with the added attention comes people who don't like that so many of our resources at the time were being put toward this particular group. I also got pushback because there were people who said, why are you calling it wicked? And I would beg to differ. I mean, if you saw an 80 or 90-year-old be pushed to the sidewalk face down or bloodied and all of his teeth were broken, how do you not call that wicked? I just think in this day and age, people need to understand who is bringing the news to you. And they are not going to open up, they are not going to connect or understand the gravity of what you're reporting, right? Because first I have videos, and these videos are a point of contention, because never in a million years have we ever had such a flood of Ring cameras and cell phones. Everybody's got one. So it is alarming to certain people who say you're glorifying these incidents, or you are doing it for the sake of getting more audience members or followers. And I would say, no, you have to back that up with stats. Stats, which, by the way, I know you showed that graphic, Bob, at the beginning from the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center. I would go a step further and say that's just a self-reporting portal. The cases that people don't know to even record and get on the record, I would say, or the number of people who reach out to me versus what makes it on TV or on social media, 90%, maybe more, 99%. I would be so bold as to say that. I mean, I have been in communities where after covering a story, I remember there was a young woman in Oakland who came up to me and said, Dion, I just want to let you know, every single member of my family has been attacked at our family's donut shop. And I said, what? And I said, did you tell anybody about this? And she said, no. And I said, are you going to? I'd love to share your story. People need to know about this. And she goes, no. Nobody would ever want that. And I've also changed the way that I've operated in the field too, because people are so scared. And people don't like that. Journalists don't like that because I will offer victims an opportunity to stay anonymous, or you can just use your first name. You could use a different name, a nickname. I will offer them concessions that I did not do before, which I think is also seen as not journalistically sound. But I mean, I guess with these uncomfortable situations, it always brings these discussions. And I'm going to go there and I'm going to say, I also get accused of being anti-Black because these perpetrators oftentimes appear to be Black. They certainly are not always Black. But I would only inflame the discussion more if I were to respond. So oftentimes I can't.
No, that's okay. In fact, I'm going to ask Steve to put all of our pictures on the screen right now as I ask everybody to think about what Dion just said. As I suggest, as an academic who's taught journalism for nearly 40 years, students ask these questions too. Why are we always homogenizing things? When people are dying and getting hurt or not getting a vaccine, we hold ourselves back, restrained by our professional standards. They understand that. But what they don't understand is photographers, like my big buddy here now, I'm going to go to you next, you will get those graphic pictures of those attacks. And then it makes me as a reporter wonder, how do I tell that story without being brutally honest? What do you think, Brian?
I think you have to explain and tell what you see. I mean, number one. So we really need, it's my job to capture the images, capture the moments. And also my job now is also to gather the sound, try to get the sound, but also if I have a reporter with me, we need to go and find the sound, find the reason, dig deeper, and don't just skim the surface. Because I think a lot of times nowadays we're stuck with these deadlines. We're stuck with feeding the monster and getting it first. And we have to sometimes slow down I mean, I'm going to go back to an incident where it was the Thai American in San Francisco that was pushed over and he was killed, the 84-year-old. And I remember, I think it was just about 8-9 months ago, we used the file video of that story. And we showed and we talked about the crime, and we showed the video of him actually getting killed, all the way being pushed down. And I called the station and said, hey, you guys are aware that you guys are showing a murder, number one. Number two, an AAPI hate crime, number two. And I think we're making it okay, by using the moment and not really reaching into why are we showing this video. We're just sort of writing another VO and we're just showing the video and plastering it. What the most ironic thing was, the next night I was watching the news, I made a phone call, called the producer, said, hey, we're showing this video. And we'll take care of it. Next evening, we're doing another follow-up story. They run the video again, all the way to showing him getting killed. This time I was really angry, called the executive producer and said, hey, you know what? Let's think about this. If this person was of a different background, different color, would we have let this slip? And it was kind of quiet on the other end. And they said, we'll take care of it. We'll look into it. So I think sometimes we have to look at ourselves and how we cover things, what our deadlines are, and how we rush through things sometimes to get it first.
And again, the pressure is always on all of us. Get ratings, keep those advertising dollars if you want to keep your job, if you want to move up and advance. But we also have to think about the impact. Now, as an audience member now that I'm retired, I look at all of those different things that go on the air and I say, what Dion is doing is not as difficult for me to accept as it is for a journalism student trying to figure out how not to get in trouble, how not to lose their job. But I tried to tell them as a teacher, sometimes you have to take the courage within you to say the words that are truthful, that the pictures at least showcase. Maybe not go beyond it, but at least tell people that you, the journalist, are able to see this is something the public should be aware of, but leave it to them to tell us in social media or whatever why we won't stand for it. And many times they will. Because we're running short on time, is there anyone else who wants to comment on this video before we go to the next one?
Was the video, the story that Dion did, was that inside a newscast or is this a station campaign?
Dion, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So it did run in a newscast. I was not asked to do this again this year, which I should probably bring up, to be honest with you. I was asked to give reflections on Lunar New Year, and this is what naturally fit. It could have been anything, but I think because of the lens that I have uniquely of covering these incidents. And I'll be honest with you, as much as I can be in this public type of forum, I wanted it to have an upbeat, right, to have a positivity note to it. But if you ask me how we are doing 1 year later, I don't know.
That's fair. Because I see two things involved here. I see a great campaign. Now, I'm speaking as a manager, so you can all throw daggers at me, okay? That I see this as a great campaign for a station that says, take action. We want to energize the community on whatever level, on whatever topic. The fact that I think that your management allowed you to do this story inside a newscast, written the way it was, speaks volumes about your management. Boy, my kiss ass. Okay, so and I worked there 3 times. Okay, so that being said, I think the one aspect, if I was the manager reading your script, I would have said, okay, you talked about the word wicked. The reason why I would have allowed it is because you also personalized that tell. You wrote it, you were asked to do it kind of like a commentary. And that's, to me, how I saw it was kind of a commentary, necessary, but it allowed commentary where we balance, Bob, about being objective, about what words we use. And I think that this requires some enlightenment among management. I certainly don't have a lot of Asian American examples, except I do have other examples as it applies to the Black community, where I, as not a non-Black person, will confront, if you will, other people in other managers in our place, in our locations, wherever we are, to say, hey, do we understand, for example, you and I talked about before, Black Lives Matter.
Right.
I think in Hawaii, nobody really understood Black Lives Matter because we don't have that activism. And my corporate management is like from the East Coast, and my local management is from Hawaii. And I kind of had to, and as a responsible minority person of color, and this is what I would say to management, my responsibility as an Asian American, as a person of color, as a woman, whatever status I put myself in, is to educate the others about it. It's really important to say, hey, you know what? This is, I know it sounds a little bit like an editorial. We're going to frame it around take action. What a great campaign if they could make that a year-long thing. I mean, if that's not community service, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But if you need to bring up the point that, hey, this is the real understanding of why. I did have somebody locally, like, I don't get Black Lives Matter. And I'm saying, you don't understand 250 years of oppression, why this is so important. And people like us, maybe because I'm older, because I've lived through or got to witness some of these other atrocities, if you will, against people of color, I feel a responsibility to educate whoever, no matter who they are, their education, or what status they have. And if I don't, then you know what? I go home and I hate myself. I have Asian hate. So I'm like, why didn't I speak up?
You don't want that.
I once was in Phoenix when I was there as executive producer, when Jesse Jackson called for a boycott of Texaco.
Mhm.
Okay? He said, don't buy your gas at Texaco. And I said, we need to find the Texaco owner who's impacted by Jesse Jackson's words. And I got blown out in the story meeting. Nah, who cares? And the next day, I kicked myself about this. There was in Mesa, Arizona, a Black owner of a Texaco station. And it was in the paper. And I said, God bless it. We should have gone out to look for that guy. How, as a Black owner of a gas station, he was feeling that Jesse Jackson would say, don't buy my product. And I regret that I didn't push hard enough in the story meeting. So I think that we have to learn those lessons.
Can I just say something really quickly? I'm so glad you brought that up because I did feel a sense of triumph, right? That my management did allow me to do that. And then also encouraged me when I had the opportunity to write an op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle to do that. And I think KGO, out of all of our station group, is a little bit more accepting of that. I would encourage people to continue, though, because the pushback part is, one trick pony, this is not necessarily your beat, but is this all you can do? I would encourage journalists today, because you spoke about, getting kiboshed in those editorial meetings and adding that context, helping. Recently, I had been following a string of robberies, 28 armed robberies, and individually, it was not enough to get enough attention that people wanted to cover them as a story, because that is how desensitized people are. But if journalists could dig a little bit deeper or find a connection, for me, I had a couple sources who provided me documentation that showed 27 out of the 28 were Asian American. And even though it does not rise to the level of a hate crime, the audience can put two and two together. And then you provide them the context, they come to the conclusion and the activism portion on their own. So whether or not that was lost on everyone else, I'm not sure, but it did make it through the editorial process.
But listen to your instinct. That's what I'm learning from all of you right now. Your instincts were right, Janice, but you allowed yourself to talk yourself out of it. And in reality, maybe that's what the audience didn't want, or wanted something different. I can speak only from the Black community and not for everybody when I say we are tired of the cookie cutter journalism stories about Black people. Talk to us about the realities, and we are more than happy to hear you tell us about the realities from your perspective. The last thing I want to get to before we wrap this up is another video that speaks to how personal we can be with our reporting. And to share part of ourselves in our stories or in our efforts as part of a learning experience. And Kit Doe is on the screen because, Kit, I want to show the trailer, the short trailer from your 2015 special about the end of the war in Vietnam and the flight from Saigon. Let's take a look at that, everyone, and then I'd like to talk about that with all of us.
The desperate end to a long and brutal war.
If I had stayed, I would probably have died.
The daring rescue to save Vietnamese orphans.
It was one of the greatest humanitarian efforts of the 20th century.
Many refugees ended up here in the Bay Area, including a mother and her young son, who is now KPIX5 reporter Kit Doe. Join us for Flight from Saigon, 40 years later, Thursday night at 7 on KPIX5.
That was an exceptional special report. So congratulations publicly for doing that. And you know, I showed it to every journalism class at San Jose State because I said, this is the type of personalization you can do because it brings home a bigger story and a bigger understanding of the story. How did you feel doing that special report?
First off, hats off to KPIX for even coming up with the concept and unleashing me to do it. So I started that whole process, I'd say probably about 9 months ahead of time. And I worked the morning shift at the time, and they would just cut me loose after my morning hits. So that went on for months, and I was able to really craft a story about where we are now. So, you know, the Vietnamese community is very unique in that it is an immigrant community that is singularly tied and bound together with one exact date in history, and that is April 30th, 1975, which happens to be my birthday. So it's like a hard date in history where we can choose to look back, or we can choose to look forward. And I've done this at the 25 year, and we did it at the 40 year, and we're probably going to do it at the 50 year too. But to me, the way I structured it is that, okay, 40 years, how far have we come? Do we still refer to ourselves as refugees? Are we following this path of the kind of the textbook sort of academic observations that we see for every immigrant community, the way they assimilate into the country? Are we following that path? Like, what are we doing now that we weren't doing when we first got here? What kind of careers are we involved in? Are we in survival mode anymore? Are we marrying inside or outside of our race? How are we preserving our culture? So it was very, very nuanced, and I was glad to do it because San Jose has the largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam of any single city like in the world. So it's a very unique situation to be in to tell the story. I'm in a extremely unique situation to tell the story, and that's why I feel like this burden on my shoulders. So I broke it up, and I covered one aspect where we look at the culture. How has the culture changed? And if you can imagine like sitting here examining how has your culture changed, and who made you the guy to do that story? So I had to make sure that you kind of check all the boxes in terms of classic sort of storytelling techniques, but also have sound journalism in there as well, and back it up with community-based support type of characters in your story that really kind of help flesh it out and make it not so much like a number story, but also like bring the whole thing to life. And then you'd kind of be remiss to not kind of tell my own personal story. And because this date is so recognized and so melancholy and infamous within the Vietnamese community, it's like being born on 9/11. Basically, like to imagine doing like an anniversary of 9/11, and you're the reporter, and you happen to be born on September 11th, 2001. So to have that kind of brings it home. It felt weird at first to make it all about you, but the way I structured it is that everybody at that time, when they were escaping Vietnam, had to make this crucial decision. Like, do I stay in the country and risk some ending up in a re-education camp and at the hands of communists? or do I go to America, leave everything I know, and head into the unknown? And so this was like the choice that my mom made, a very human choice. A lot of, like, every refugee makes this decision. And so the way I structured the story is that you don't find out it's me until the end. And so you have this human story, and oh, by the way, it happened to be me. So, you know, you talk about reporter involvement. You just kind of can't help it. You know, like if I would be foolish to kind of ignore it at this point. And I think the audience kind of came along for the ride. And when they found out, they were okay with it.
Yeah, I believe they were. Certainly the audiences on college campuses seem to appreciate that approach. Let's bring in George and Pamela and stay with us on the screen, Kit, because I want to ask the manager people, folks. So now if a reporter comes to you and says, I'm Black, or I'm Vietnamese, or I'm from this culture, this date is coming up, or could we do a story about 9/11, being born on 9/11, and always having your life be a depressing day on your birthday because of it? How would you pitch that story to get it through, to get it done?
I've never had any problems pitching stories about my community to my management, and it's a peculiar situation. My news director is Asian American, and my general manager is Asian American. But it's not because of that. It's because I think I'm older, and I have somewhat of an image and a responsibility, and I think they recognize that. So whenever I pitch a story about Chinese Americans and what they're going through, or a holiday, or an award that someone is getting, a veteran, the answer has always been yes, go to it.
And when they want to tell their personal element in the story, is that acceptable in journalism? Because I know students like to try that in school, and they point to Kit Do and say he did it. So why can't everybody else do it? George.
Well, for me, I actually would be 100% behind it, because back in 2007, NBC Bay Area did a 1-hour documentary called Dreams to Dust, which originally started out as going to be a personal journey of mine. But then when my executive producer at the time, who now is actually executive producer at KTVU, we talk about it, she got wind of it and said, I'm fascinated by this story of your family incarcerated in these camps during World War II. And she says, tell me more. And then as I begin to talk about it, she says, isn't Mike Inoue and Rob Maeda, don't they have also? I go, yeah, they do. In fact, I just talked to them within the last week. They had stories. So she says, I want this to become bigger. You know, not just your story, but we have Japanese American journalists in our station who have a bond, a similar bond. And maybe you guys can talk about it, and then we'll go from there. Then she went on a smoke break, came back and said, you know what? I want to expand even further. This is the Bay Area. We have a Japanese American community here, and I want to see it expanded. Start off with the core, the heart of the story is the three of you, but then expand it to beyond you into the entire Japanese American community in the San Francisco Bay Area. That executive producer is a white woman, not an Asian American woman. Folk put a full support behind it, approached the news director, Jim Sanders, at the time, and he was 100% behind it. I think it comes when you explain what the story is about, why it matters, why it's important, the importance of it in history, and the relevance it has now, still has relevance. I think you can sell it that way, still tell your personal story, still keep your journalistic integrity, and the whole community wins.
I'm glad that they expanded it out. That is key, because I think for you to focus on just the on-air talent and tell their story only, that I don't think would sit well with the audience.
Very good. I totally agree. And if we could, let's put everybody on the screen as we start to count down towards the end of our program. I want everybody to weigh in on this. It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, diversity reporting is a risk-taking proposition that's well worth it, as long as it's carefully thought out and planned. So why aren't more people doing it?
Because it takes time and it takes energy, and you're not feeding the beast. But I think the key is to show that there is some return on investment of that. and let them know that it is not the trendy thing to do. It is the right thing to do.
Very good. You're shaking your head. I can see you, Brian. What do you
No,
think?
I don't want to slam my employer or anything, but it's always one of those things where you've got so much time to fill.
Yeah.
And management always seems to have only so much time to listen. And we still have to do the daily story count, and you have to hit the basics. But then again, on the flip side, I think we are changing right now where I'm working at, where they're trying to do more intimate stories. Let's just hope that we can incorporate diversity into those intimate stories. And I think that's where we all fit in, is to remind our employer that this is a very diverse community and we have a lot of stories out there to continue to tell and reflect.
Very good. You've just given me a thought to challenge George and some of our other managers. So if I came to one of you guys and said, I have a personal story, my sister has Down syndrome, 66 years old, is in hospice care in my home right now, and I'm taking her to the end because I promised my mother. Tell me why that's not a story.
I mean, personally and professionally, I mean, listening to what you're saying and the effect it has on your family, definitely you're going to have a receptive ear. I would like to hear more about how we shape it as a story. And I'm fully supportive of telling stories, no matter where it's from or what community it's from. So I'm always open. But of course, I come from a different perspective. I don't know what another manager at my staff would feel. However, if it's pitched and I know what the importance of it, the effect of it, the impact on community beyond you, I'd be 100% behind it. And I would probably I have your back at those meetings where people are like, throwing things at you and saying, well, what about this? And what about that? So.
And that's it. People will try to pick it apart with a lot more questioning. But Pamela, if I have this determination to open up my life or to open up someone else's life who wants to get more support for people with disabilities or people for the Asian American community or whatever, how do you convince management, let's take the risk and put it on the air?
I think that management would ask, how is it going to affect the greater community as well as your own situation? And if you have a reason for that, I mean, today there are so many freaking shows that we have to fill. I have never been turned down. And sometimes I'll say, I'm sorry, the story is 3 minutes long. Very often they'll come back and say, can you do 3.5? Can you do 4? Because we are content hungry. But as long as it's going to impact someone other than me, myself, there's a reason to do it.
We just have a few more seconds.
I just have a recommendation for you, Bob, when you make your pitch, right? Can you think of a way to broaden it so it is Disabilities Awareness Month, plus coupling that with the economics of it? For ABC7, it's building a better Bay Area. So you're thinking of the financials. So having that insider look, or maybe your sister has a friend who has also gone through a similar experience, and doing that extra legwork prior to going into that editorial meeting. I've always said, will then add credibility when at the end you do get greenlit for the story and they realize, oh, it resonated because it was the #1 story. That gives you ammo to tell another one next week.
That's a good recommendation. I do like that. I have thought about pitching the idea and saying, do you realize the numbers, the hundreds, if not thousands, around the country of people like my sister who don't have support systems, that are homeless or are in situations where they're not surviving as long as she is? Final thoughts from anyone? Janice? Janice, we just lost you there. Anyone else have any final thoughts?
My final thought is that I think about where we've come in the past year, and there are days where it feels like we are moving 2 steps ahead and then going in reverse 10 steps back. I have this recommendation for whenever you feel very defeated. Find one person who will also chime in with you. In the Obama administration, I heard this on NPR, there were women who felt like they were not being heard in the morning meeting. So beforehand, they would plan that when one spoke, the other would chime in. something I've actually employed in the past 3 days. And with success, all of them became VOs, none packages, but still, to me, that was a win. So that was my one step forward for the week, and I'll take that.
To add to what Dion is saying, I was about to talk about that. Finding an ally in the newsroom, or go to a manager and speak to a manager before the meeting and get his or her take on it, and eventually their support, so that when it comes to the meeting setting, you have a manager on your side, plus any other reporters who've heard your story, and they can chime in and support you as well. So yeah, having allies and creating alliances in the newsroom, very key to pushing things forward. I learned that as a early manager, now almost 8 years in. I realized that's how you get things done. So
now you're talking, folks. Janice, you're back. You have a quick 30 seconds.
Just really quickly here, I would ask anybody who wants to tell a personal story is a totally great story. I will tell you that. Number two, though, is I would caution you I would ask you the question, are you prepared for being in the spotlight? Because social media is so cruel. People say weird and mean things. Are you really willing to put your story out there for the public to dissect and judge? And if you're comfortable with that, I'm ready to go with it. I think that personal story is what we always ask people to do. So it's your personal story. Okay, that's okay. I like Dion's idea of just broadening it out a little bit, not just your only you. There's other people like your sister who also have needs and issues, if you will, that you want to illuminate. But I do think that people sometimes come to the table and want to tell their story. Let's say Japanese American internment. You're going to get some pushback. You're going to get public hate. Talk about Asian hate. You're going to get people. I did my whole thesis as a graduate student on that subject. I was shocked that my teacher did not. He actually talked negatively about my report. Because he said the U.S. was justified. I'm like, oh my God, you missed the point. But you just have to be prepared for that.
Be strategic, have a voice, open your mouth and say it, don't hold it back, and then follow through with facts, figures, and do a good journalistic job. That's what I learned from all of you today. And I do hope you'll all consider coming back sometime. We might have something else to talk about. But thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Aloha.
you.
You have been remarkable, and we appreciate it. Our Academy chapter thanks all of you for your openness and your thought-provoking ideas. It's been a great diversity learning experience. But I want to tell you real quickly, looking ahead in the series to June and National Gay Pride celebrations, we plan to assemble a group of LGBTQI active and retired television professionals to talk about the history of risk taking your truth public in TV news, and how many times that has been a challenge in broadcasting. When I was in major cities as a gay reporter and anchor, I had to make sure I didn't show up in a newspaper gossip column if I wanted to keep my paycheck. So in June, several of my colleagues are going to get together and we're going to talk about being gay and lesbian in the broadcasting industry. Another program we hope to record this summer and stream in September will focus on Latino and Hispanic journalism views, life experiences, and ongoing concerns in the broadcast industry. If Academy members wish to suggest someone for these next two panels or just offer questions for them, please use my email and contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. And very quickly, the Diversity Series project was created to inform and educate about all cultural experiences in a safe space where we can open ears and minds and hearts among colleagues and decision makers who brainstorm new approaches to storytelling every day. Our focus is always on truth-telling, what we do, and what people in our communities have relied on for decades. By sharing our individual cultural truths, and certainly with our industry colleagues, we truly hope to make a difference in our profession by helping everyone to be heard, understood, and included in critical decision-making that opens up those new connections that will build that public trust. So I need to stop talking and say thank you for taking time to be with us this month. Happy Memorial Day coming up to everybody. And be sure to tell your other friends in the industry to check us out, and our friends in higher education as well. For now, I'll just say thank you very much for watching. Take good care, and we'll see you again soon.